So to get a couple of common ways to hold the club out of the way, just so you have a basic idea of what you're looking at, the three most common ways to hold the club are to either put a 10-finger grip on where there's no interaction between this pinky and this pointer finger, an overlap grip where that one sits right over the top of it, and an interlock grip. So in my opinion, they make close to no difference to me which one you like the best. That is the least important part of your grip, in my opinion. It really comes down to comfort, and so to describe it in the best way, they all have slight advantages or disadvantages over each other, but there are tour players that have all those grips. Probably the most common one is an overlap grip, but an interlock grip, I believe that Jack Nicklaus, Tiger Woods, Rory McIlroy, they all use an interlock grip. Much more use the overlap, and then there's a handful that use the 10-finger grip. That isn't going to make or break a good grip. Those are really just for comfort. The only thing I'd want to point out is that if you are using the interlock grip, as good a grip as that is, just be careful that when you interlock that those fingers, that you just interlock them kind of in the kind of where your hands start, and rather than using that interlock to try to dig that in, because all that's going to do is mess up where your trail hand goes. You're going to take it in too far, and you're going to see that your hand goes on too far underneath, like I've got it here. But in all reality, it doesn't really make any difference to me, or shouldn't to you, which one of those you use. If you find that a 10-finger grip works the best for you, go for it. Overlap is the one I use, but I've also used a interlock in the past, and when I was a kid I used the 10-finger grip, just not knowing any different. It didn't stop me, and it wouldn't stop you from being able to hit the ball and doing all the important stuff in your grip. So one of the first basics you're looking for in your grip is to find enough control that the club isn't going to move around without you controlling that. So when I'm saying that, you need to have enough strength in your hands. And I don't mean that you need to get stronger necessarily. I mean that you need to have your hand in a position on the club so that the club isn't going to want to move around. And just to show you what I mean by that, you can take your lead hand, left hand for most of you, for all the right-handed golfers, and I'll just show you what I mean by that. So just using this pointer finger from your other hand as a reference, kind of tell you how much pressure you can get into it. If you were to put your hand, put your finger through your hand here, it goes right along your lifeline. If you're to pay close attention to these three fingers and you squeeze your hand from this position, pay attention to how much strength you have there. And then also pay attention to how easy it would be to pull that finger out of there. Even if you were to squeeze that as hard as you could probably actually still pull it out of there, even though you're given full strength here. As opposed to if you start moving your finger closer to the base of those fingers, and then if we did the same exact exercise, so we went squeeze that finger, now if you wanted to squeeze that and pull on it, you're probably not going to get that finger to move. And so you should be able to notice pretty naturally that you can find a lot more strength in your hand as you get a little closer to here. You might find that this is where your hand, or where it's the strongest, but it's going to be generally in this part of your hand, as opposed to this part of your hand, which is actually extremely common. When I first teaching somebody, this is actually a really common place to go in the hand, and for this reason, you don't have very good control there. So in a very general sense, you don't want the club moving around in your hand. So we've talked about the left hand, and what's very helpful is once you've got that left hand on there, or your lead hand, it gives you a nice little guide for where your other hand goes. So what I'd like you to recognize is there's different parts of your hands that have leverage and strength. And so with your lead hand or your left hand, we've kind of established one of those things. And then we've got to kind of deal with that hand when we're putting the other hand on there. So when we're looking for where our hand will work for our right hand, if you look at your thumb and you look at your lifeline, they can actually line up almost perfectly together. And it kind of gives you an idea of the direction that your hand is going. And once it's there, what you're kind of looking for is where can your hand find some strength. And you might find that strength a little bit further out in your fingers than the first example where it's here. You can also find a different part that you have a lot of strength. If you were to think in terms of a way that you might hold a suitcase or something like that, you might find that next part of your hand that's pretty strong, and that's the one we're looking for. And what you should feel is that you can create that, almost like you're locking your hands together, or you're just making them work together, and you can almost squeeze that lifeline into that thumb. Now, I'm not saying you have to squeeze that as hard as you can, but you should have the ability to do that. And then with the top of your hand, we're trying to create kind of a structure here so that club can't wander around in your hand. So if I have a really wide space here, that club is really easy to move around, and I don't want it to be moving in my hand. I want to create a really nice stable place for that club to be. So I'm going to put my hands together a little bit tighter together. So I can use that left hand thumb to line up with my lifeline, and then I'm going to be looking for where I've got strength a little bit further out in those fingers, and I'm going to create that structure. And at that point I can get those hands to really have really good control of the club. The next important aspect of a functional grip is your ability to square a club face. What I mean by that is the ball is going to basically go in the direction this club face is pointing, both for the loft and the direction. That's mostly true. And so it really comes down to our ability to get that in the middle of our swing to come back to a ball with the face pointing in the direction that we're hoping it's pointing. The way that I like to think about this is that lead arm. My goal with the lead arm, at least for me personally, and what I teach my students, is to get that lead arm to be in a position that it otherwise would like to be in the first place. And what you might notice is if you were to dangle that arm or let it hang off to the side, it doesn't hang perfectly where the back of your hand is pointing at your target, or however you want to think of that. It doesn't hang like this. Almost everybody's hangs in some general sense like this. If you can see by that, I mean that this hand is almost turned about 45 degrees. Now, you can play around with that a little bit to help yourself square the face, but in a general sense, that's what we're trying to accomplish. So if you have that in mind, what we were just talking about, where you're trying to find the control, as well as this idea that your hand is going to be kind of more in its natural state, with a square club face on the ground. So you can see the club face there. With a square club face on the ground, you might find that that arm can be in a very relaxed position. You have that control that we were just talking about. And that hand is easier to return to its place that it wanted to be in the first place, as opposed to turning your hand to here. Now, it's not impossible to square club face from there. It's just not as natural. And that's really what that becomes. So, and then if we're talking about that trail hand, this is the hand that I think has, in my swing or my golf game, this is the one that has more awareness. And I think it's easier to get that awareness by putting this hand in a position that more matches the face. So as I was describing in this hand, it doesn't necessarily match the face. In my case, it's turned a little bit. Might be a little stronger grip for a lot of you, but it's that's where my hand likes to gravitate towards. And then with that trail hand, I like to get this hand in a position that really matches the club face. So if you were to think about, my hand is pointing at my target here, and so is my club face. My club face has loft, my hand doesn't, but in the general sense, they're both pointing in this direction. So I'm trying to line that up while I'm looking for that control we were already talking about. So then when I'm trying to hit a shot, the game basically becomes, can I hit something really square with this hand? Now we can play around with loft and that sort of thing, but in a very basic sense, you're trying to get your trail hand back to square. And if you're thinking of it that way, in the same way that you'd have an idea whether this is pointing at the sky or this is pointing at the ground, you have that awareness kind of built into that grip. So you can recognize that this is closed and this is open in the same way that you can recognize that. And so then when you're in the middle of your swing, you have that awareness and you're really just trying to find that position where your hand can come back to square. And those are the things that really add up to your ability to square the club face. There's obviously a lot of other moving parts in a golf swing, but if you have an idea of how your grip fits in with that squaring the club face, it's a very helpful part of your grip. So the last important goal of your grip is to get coordination between your two hands. So this is where the goals of each hand individually have to line up with each other. So if we're looking for that control in our hands, and we're looking for where we've got that, got our hand where we maybe see a couple knuckles here, line this one up, get that hand lined up with that club face. At this point, you should have the ability to move that club side to side, up and down. And what I'd like you to pay close attention to is that there isn't movement in your fingers. There can be movements in your wrists, your arms as you're doing this, but I don't want you to be letting that club go as you're doing this. So we can go up and down with that grip. We can go side to side, kind of as a bonus tip here. As you're doing the side to side one, make sure that the face isn't going like this, going open to close. Just keep it square, always pointing in that same direction. Kind of get used to how your hands move that way. And then you can make circles in both directions. And it should feel like your grip allows you to do this. And if your hands are and not working together, it should feel clumsy, at least in one of those ways. It shouldn't feel very natural to do those if your hands aren't working together. So if you can find where you've got control, you can find where you have awareness of where the club face is, and you can do this kind of thing, side to side, up and down, circles in both directions without that club coming loose in your hands, you probably have a pretty functional grip. And that's what I'd like you to be striving for when you're building your grip.